October 23, 1944. In the dark forests of Belgium, just short of the German border, veteran Wehrmacht soldiers settled into their positions and waited. These were not inexperienced men. They were survivors, soldiers who had fought across continents, who had endured Russian winters and North African heat, who believed they understood the Americans by now. The reports said a new U.S. division had arrived at the front, fresh troops, untried, recently shipped from home, green Americans. German officers were confident. They had broken American units before. They knew the signs: too much noise, too much hesitation, too much fear once the shooting started. Another night, another lesson. But as darkness spread through the trees, something felt wrong. There was no careless movement, no shouted orders, no nervous rifle fire cutting into the black. The forest remained unnaturally still. Then the night came alive. German positions vanished without warning. Outposts went silent before. Alarms could be raised. Machine guns opened fire into empty darkness. Artillery thundered blindly, shells exploding among trees and shadows. Men shouted warnings they could not explain. By morning, hardened German soldiers were shaken. Units had been overrun without ever clearly seeing their attackers. Defensive lines that looked secure in daylight had collapsed in hours. This was not how inexperienced troops fought, and as word spread through the German ranks, one realization became impossible to ignore. They had misjudged their enemy. The Americans had brought a commander who did not fight by familiar rules. They called him Terrible Terry Allen, and the night no longer belonged to Germany. Terry de la Mesa Allen was born into the United States Army. On April 1, 1888, he entered the world at Fort Douglas, in what was still the Utah Territory. Soldiers, uniforms, and duty were not abstractions in his childhood. They were the air he breathed. His father was a career Army officer, and the family's military lineage stretched back to the American Civil War. Service was not a choice in the Allen household, it was inheritance. Allen grew up moving from post to post across the American frontier. He learned to ride before he learned to read properly. He learned to shoot before he mastered arithmetic. This was the old army, cavalry army, where initiative mattered more than polish, and survival mattered more than appearances. But the army was changing. In 1907, Allen entered the United States Military Academy at West Point, the institution that defined what a modern American officer was supposed to be. And almost immediately, he was out of place. West Point demanded discipline, conformity, and academic precision. Allen struggled with mathematics. He bristled under rigid rules. He collected demerits. He stuttered when speaking in class. His restless energy earned him an unflattering nickname among his peers. He was not stupid. He was impatient. Where West Point rewarded men who could sit still and follow procedure, Allen wanted movement, action, decisions made under pressure. He believed war was not won on blackboards, but in mud, smoke, and confusion. In 1911, the Academy made its decision. Terry Allen was dismissed. For most men, failure at West Point was the end of a military career. The shame alone was enough to close every door the Army had to offer. But Allen refused to accept that verdict. If the front entrance was closed, he would find another way in. He earned a civilian degree. He studied relentlessly. And in 1912, he received his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army, without West Point, without pedigree, without approval. The Army had rejected him. But Terry Allen was not finished with the Army, and the rules that expelled him were the same rules he would one day challenge on the battlefield, because he believed they got soldiers killed. Terry Allen entered the Army the hard way. Without West Point behind his name, he arrived as an outsider, commissioned, but watched closely. The institution had rules for how officers were supposed to think, move, and decide. Allen learned quickly that he did not fit those expectations, and he made little effort to pretend otherwise. In 1913, while serving on the Mexican border, Allen was given a small detachment tasked with routine patrol duties. The frontier was tense. Armed bands crossed the border frequently, stealing livestock and testing American responses. One day, Allen received word that a group of roughly 30 armed rustlers had crossed into U.S. territory. Standard procedure was clear. Observe, report, wait for reinforcements. Allen did not wait. With just 6 soldiers under his command, he moved immediately. He tracked the rustlers, closed the distance, and attacked before they understood they had been found. The fight was brief and decisive. The rustlers were killed or captured. The threat ended before reinforcements ever arrived. It was not the action of a careful, by-the-book officer. It was the action of a man who believed hesitation was more dangerous than risk. This incident defined Allen's reputation early. Superiors saw him as aggressive, impulsive, and difficult to control. His soldiers saw something else entirely, a commander who would not leave them exposed while paperwork caught up with reality. Then came the war in Europe. When the United States entered World War I, Allen was desperate to fight. Like many young officers, he feared the war would end before he ever proved himself. When he finally reached France in 1918, his assignment was a disappointment. Instead of leading men into battle, he was placed in charge of an ammunition train hauling shells to the front. It was unglamorous work, dangerous, exhausting, and invisible. Allen accepted it without complaint. He learned the rhythm of modern warfare from the margins, how battles were supplied, how mistakes echoed forward, how delays killed men just as surely as bullets. And he waited, because Terry Allen did not let go once he set his sights on something. Soon, the Army would give him what he had been waiting for. And when it did, he would never fight the same way again. In 1918, Terry Allen finally got his war. When he arrived in France, the reality was not what he had imagined. Instead of leading men into battle, he was assigned to an ammunition train attached to the 90th Division. Day after day, he hauled artillery shells forward under fire, watching others fight while he stayed behind the lines. It was dangerous work. Shells exploded along narrow roads, wagons overturned, men died without ever seeing the enemy. Allen learned something important during those months. Modern war was not heroic or orderly. It was mechanical, chaotic, and unforgiving. Mistakes rippled outward, killing men who had never been part of the decision. Eventually, the Army gave him what he wanted. Allen was assigned command of a battalion in the 358th Infantry Regiment. At last, he would lead men in combat. And almost immediately, he began to notice something that troubled him. Daylight attacks were slaughter. Men went forward across open ground, while machine guns cut them down in rows. Artillery observers adjusted fire with precision. Defensive positions were clear, fields of fire carefully prepared. Casualties mounted by the minute, and commanders accepted them as inevitable. Allen refused to. As the fighting ground on through Saint-Mihiel and into the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he began experimenting with something most officers avoided. Night attacks. Army doctrine discouraged them. Darkness caused confusion. Units became lost. Friendly fire incidents increased. Commanders feared losing control. The accepted wisdom was simple: defend at night, attack by day. But Allen saw the battlefield differently. At night, machine gunners could not see their targets. Artillery fired blindly. Defensive coordination broke down. Fear spread faster than orders, and most importantly, the attacker gained surprise. Allen stripped his plans down to their essentials. Objectives were simple. Routes were rehearsed in daylight. Every soldier knew exactly where he was supposed to go and what he was supposed to do. Complexity was removed wherever possible. When the attacks came, they came quietly. Men moved forward without speaking, guided by memory, compass, and instinct. When contact was made, violence was sudden and overwhelming. Positions were taken before defenders understood what was happening. The results were impossible to ignore. Night attacks cost fewer lives. On October 24, 1918, during one of these operations, Allen was hit by machine gun fire. A bullet tore into his face. Medics ordered him evacuated immediately. Allen refused. Blood streamed down his uniform as he stayed with his men, directing the fight until the objective was secured. To his soldiers, the message was unmistakable. Their commander would not abandon them, not under fire, not wounded, not ever. For his actions, Allen was awarded the Silver Star and multiple Purple Hearts. But the real reward was less visible. He had learned something the Army had not yet accepted. Daylight favored the defender. Darkness favored the prepared. When the war ended, Allen returned home with a reputation as a brave officer and a capable leader. But the lesson he carried with him mattered far more than medals. He had discovered that the night was not a weakness. Used correctly, it was a weapon, and one day he would build an entire way of fighting around it. When the guns fell silent in 1918, Terry Allen returned to a very different battlefield. The United States Army shrank almost overnight. Millions of men were demobilized, units were dissolved, budgets vanished. By the early 1920s, the Army had been reduced to a fraction of its wartime strength. For ambitious officers, it was a professional dead end. Promotions froze. Men who had commanded battalions in combat found themselves stuck at the same rank year after year. Some resigned in frustration, others drifted into routine, marking time until retirement. Allen did neither. The interwar years were hard, but he refused to waste them. If the Army would not give him opportunity, he would create preparation. He trained relentlessly, pushing his own limits as hard as he had pushed his men's. In 1920, he completed a brutal 300-mile endurance horseback ride across Texas, finishing in just over 4 days, an old cavalryman proving he had lost nothing. That same year, he represented the United States Army in the Olympic Games, earning a bronze medal in polo. It was a reminder that beneath his rough edges was discipline, focus, and control. But Allen was not clinging to the past. As the world changed, he watched closely. He studied the battles of World War I in detail, what had worked, what had failed, and why so many men had died unnecessarily. He followed developments in tanks, aircraft, radios, and mechanized warfare. He read German doctrine carefully, paying attention to how future enemies thought about speed, coordination, and shock. Most importantly, wherever he served, Allen trained his soldiers as if war were inevitable. Field exercises were realistic and unforgiving. Maneuvers were aggressive. Mistakes were corrected immediately. Allen believed peacetime habits decided wartime outcomes, and he refused to let complacency take root. To many superiors, he seemed out of step, too intense, too demanding, too focused on a conflict that might never come. But Allen was certain of one thing: another war was coming. And when it did, he intended to be ready, not just to fight it, but to fight it better than the last one. For nearly 20 years, Terry Allen waited, not in idleness, in preparation. And when the Army finally needed leaders who understood real combat, it would discover that one of them had been preparing all along. By 1940, the world was at war again. Germany had crushed Poland, overrun France, and reshaped Europe in months. The United States was still officially at peace, but no one in Washington believed that peace would last. The American Army, small and underfunded for 2 decades, suddenly faced the reality of a modern war it was not ready to fight. At the center of that reckoning was General George C. Marshall, the new Army Chief of Staff. Marshall understood something many did not. The next war would not be won by seniority or spotless records. It would be won by men who could lead under fire, adapt quickly, and keep soldiers alive in chaos. He began searching for officers who had proven themselves in real combat, not just on paper. One name stood out: Terry Allen. On paper, Allen was an unlikely choice. He was rough around the edges. He drank, he cursed, he ignored appearances. His career had stalled for years, and he had never fit the Army's ideal image of a polished commander. But Marshall saw past that. He saw an officer who had fought in World War I, learned from it, and never stopped preparing for the next one. He saw a leader who trained hard, demanded realism, and understood how battles were actually won. In a move that shocked much of the Army, Marshall promoted Allen directly from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general, skipping an entire rank. It was an extraordinary decision, and a risky one. Senior officers objected. Some questioned Allen's temperament. Others doubted his discipline. Marshall overruled them. He believed Allen could do something more important than follow rules. He believed Allen could fight. In May 1942, Marshall gave Allen the command that would define his reputation: the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. The Army's oldest and most prestigious division, a formation heavy with tradition, expectation, and scrutiny. It was a test. Allen now had thousands of men under his command. If his methods failed, there would be no hiding it. If his instincts were wrong, the cost would be measured in lives. But if Marshall's gamble paid off, the United States Army would gain something it desperately needed: a commander who knew how to win modern wars. And Terry Allen was about to prove that his way of fighting, unorthodox, aggressive, and unforgiving, worked where doctrine alone did not. On November 8, 1942, Terry Allen led the 1st Infantry Division ashore in North Africa. Operation Torch was the first major American ground offensive of the war against German forces. For many of the men landing on the beaches of Algeria, it was their first experience of combat. They were facing an enemy who had been fighting and winning for 3 years. The landings were chaotic. Confusion reigned along the beaches. Units became mixed. Enemy fire cut into the surf. By the end of the day, the Big Red One had taken hundreds of casualties. But Allen's division secured its objectives. The Americans were finally in the war. Then came Tunisia. The desert fighting was brutal and unforgiving. German forces under seasoned commanders were fast, coordinated, and aggressive. American units, still learning how to fight together, made mistakes. Those mistakes were punished immediately. In February 1943, the Germans struck hard at Kasserine Pass. American lines buckled. Units retreated in confusion. Tanks were abandoned. Entire formations collapsed under pressure. It was the first time U.S. forces had faced a full-scale German counteroffensive, and it nearly broke them. Allen was rushed into the crisis. At Jebel el Hamra, he took personal control of the situation. He positioned infantry carefully, coordinated artillery fire himself, and refused to yield ground unnecessarily. Under his direction, American forces halted the German advance, captured hundreds of prisoners, and stabilized the front. The disaster was contained, but the lesson was clear. American soldiers could fight. They could endure. But without decisive leadership, they would be outmaneuvered and overwhelmed by a veteran enemy. The true test came weeks later at El Gueter. For days, German tanks probed the American lines, searching for weakness. Allen understood what was at stake. If his division broke, the Germans could roll up the Allied front and undo months of effort. On March 23, 1943, German armor punched through forward positions and moved toward Allen's headquarters. Staff officers urged him to withdraw to a safer location. The recommendation was logical. Divisional headquarters were not meant to sit in the path of advancing tanks. Allen refused. He understood morale as well as tactics. If headquarters pulled back, the men at the front would see it, and fear would spread faster than orders. Allen stayed where he was, calm, visible, unmoved. His soldiers held. American artillery and tank destroyers opened. Fire at close range. German tanks burned in the desert heat. The attack stalled. Then it collapsed. El Gueter was more than a defensive victory. It was the first time American ground forces had defeated experienced German armored units in sustained combat. The Big Red One had learned how to fight, and Terry Allen had proven that leadership, personal, stubborn, and unyielding, could turn disaster into resolve. But as victories mounted, something else began to grow quietly in the background: concern. Because Allen was winning battles, just not in the way the Army preferred. El Gueter changed how the American Army saw itself. The German attacks had been stopped, the line had held, burned-out tanks littered the desert floor, and for the first time, American infantry could say they had beaten experienced German armored units in a sustained fight. The Big Red One had stood its ground and won. But Terry Allen's way of fighting left scars beyond the battlefield. His division fought hard, moved fast, and stayed aggressive. Standards of appearance slipped, beards grew, uniforms became dusty, torn, and unimportant. Officers led from the front instead of behind desks. Allen cared far more about whether his men could fight than how they looked while doing it. That worried higher command. In July 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. Once again, Allen and the 1st Infantry Division were given one of the most dangerous assignments. General George Patton himself requested the Big Red One for the assault at Gela, believing no other American division could handle the pressure. The landings were violent, but successful. Then, the Germans counterattacked. On July 11th, German tanks surged toward the beaches, threatening to split the Allied foothold in two. American infantry fought in open terrain against armor, holding their ground while naval gunfire roared overhead. Shells from ships offshore passed just above American helmets before slamming into advancing tanks. The line held. As the campaign moved inland, the fighting only grew worse. In the mountains around the town of Troina, the Germans turned rugged terrain into a fortress. The fighting there lasted nearly a week and became one of the bloodiest engagements of the Sicily campaign. Allen's men attacked uphill into prepared positions. They fought house to house, ridge to ridge. German forces launched counterattack after counterattack, 24 in total, trying to break the Americans and throw them back down the slopes. Each one failed. The cost was heavy. Companies were reduced to half strength. Exhausted soldiers fought on with barely any rest. Medics worked without pause. But the Big Red One kept moving forward, grinding the German defenders down through sheer persistence. Troina finally fell. By any measurable standard, Terry Allen had succeeded. Every objective assigned to his division had been taken. Every German counterattack had been repelled. His men trusted him completely. They would follow him anywhere. And that, paradoxically, was the problem. Senior commanders grew uneasy. Allen's division was becoming elite, confident, aggressive, and fiercely loyal to its commander. Discipline, as defined by regulations and appearance, had taken a back seat to combat effectiveness. To some, Allen looked less like a model officer and more like a liability. In early August 1943, while his division was still fighting in Sicily, the decision was made. Terry Allen would be relieved of command. Days later, as American newspapers celebrated his victories and placed his photograph on magazine covers, the order was already in motion. The Army had decided that while Allen could win battles, he did not fit the mold required for the long war ahead. He had fought brilliantly, he had led fearlessly, but he had done it his way, and for that, Terry Allen was about to pay the price. In early August 1943, Terry Allen reached the peak of his career. The 1st Infantry Division had fought almost continuously since North Africa. They had landed under fire, held when others broke, and forced their way through some of the hardest fighting American troops had yet faced in Europe. German veterans respected them. Allied commanders relied on them. And yet, behind the front lines, confidence in their commander was eroding. Officially, the concerns were about discipline. Reports described relaxed standards, loose formations, officers too close to their men. The Big Red One no longer looked like the Army in the manuals. It looked like a division shaped by combat rather than regulation. Unofficially, the problem was simpler. Terry Allen made people nervous. He swore openly. He drank. He ignored appearances. He cared more about winning battles than satisfying expectations. For an army preparing for a long global war, he did not fit the image of the commander it wanted to promote. On August 7, 1943, the order came down. Allen was relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division. 2 days later, as the decision took effect, Time magazine hit newsstands across the United States. On the cover was Major General Terry Allen, celebrated as one of America's most successful combat commanders in North Africa and Sicily. The contrast was brutal. In private, senior leaders admitted the truth. Allen had not been removed for incompetence. His superiors acknowledged that he was exceptional in combat. But they believed he lacked the instincts of a disciplinarian. They believed his style, effective as it was, could not be sustained across years of war. Allen was sent home. His assistant commander, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., was relieved as well. The division they had forged together moved on without them, tightened, polished, and reshaped for the campaigns ahead. For most officers, this would have been the end. A quiet retirement. A footnote. A career defined by what might have been. But Terry Allen was not finished. He did not argue. He did not protest publicly. He did not disappear. Instead, he asked for another chance. And the Army, unsure of what to do with him, gave him one more command, smaller, quieter, and far from the headlines. They believed the problem had been solved. They were wrong. In October 1943, Terry Allen was given a new command. It was not a prestigious division. It did not carry history or reputation. The 104th Infantry Division was still forming at Camp Adair, Oregon. Thousands of young men pulled from farms, factories, and small towns across the western United States. They were green, inexperienced, untested, To many officers, the 104th was a dead-end assignment. To Allen, it was something else entirely. It was a blank slate. Allen did not see weakness in these young soldiers. He saw opportunity. They had no bad habits yet, no false confidence, no illusions about war. He intended to shape them from the ground up, and he knew exactly how. Training began immediately, and it was relentless. While other divisions trained 10 to 12 hours a week, Allen pushed his men 3 times harder. Long marches, field exercises that ran late into the night, maneuvers conducted in rain, mud, and darkness. Mistakes were corrected instantly. Excuses were not tolerated. But Allen's true obsession was the night. He trained the 104th to move in darkness as if it were daylight. Soldiers learned to navigate by compass and terrain, not by sight. Orders were simplified so they could be remembered under stress. Hand signals replaced shouted commands. Units practiced attacking without radios, without lights, without noise. Night attacks were repeated again and again, first with squads, then companies, then entire battalions. Artillery support was coordinated without visual contact. Reorganization drills were practiced until confusion became routine rather than panic. Allen was not trying to make his men fearless. He was trying to make them competent. He believed that fear was unavoidable. Training was what kept fear from becoming chaos, and he believed that soldiers who mastered the night would survive battles that destroyed others in daylight. Other commanders thought he was pushing too hard. His men were exhausted, injuries mounted, complaints reached higher headquarters. Allen ignored them. He knew what awaited his division in Europe. He knew that untrained men died first, and he refused to send these soldiers into combat unprepared. By the summer of 1944, the 104th Infantry Division shipped out for Europe. They arrived without fanfare, no reputation, no headlines, just a quiet confidence forged in darkness. Allen had given them an identity. They called themselves the Timberwolves. And when they reached the front, the Germans would soon learn what that meant. On October 23, 1944, the 104th Infantry Division entered combat near the German border in Belgium. The German soldiers waiting in those forests believed they knew what was coming. Intelligence reports described the Timberwolves as a new American division, recently arrived, never tested in battle. They expected hesitation, noise, mistakes. What they encountered instead felt unreal. The first attacks came after dark. American companies moved through the forest without speaking, navigating by compass and memory. They approached German positions from unexpected directions, slipping past listening posts and patrols before defenders understood they were there. Entire outposts were eliminated before alarms could be raised. Machine guns fired blindly into the darkness. Artillery fell without clear targets. German officers tried to regain control, but the battlefield no longer made sense. The enemy could not be seen, only felt, appearing suddenly, striking hard, then vanishing back into the night. By morning, German units were shaken. Positions that had held for months collapsed in hours. Platoons reported being overrun without ever seeing who attacked them. Veteran soldiers began to speak openly about an American division that fought differently, quietly, patiently, and without hesitation after dark. The pattern repeated again and again. In November, the Timberwolves crossed the Mark River in a night operation that caught German defenders completely off guard. Later that month, they attacked fortified positions in the Hürtgen region, cracking defenses that daylight assaults had failed to break. Even during the German Ardennes offensive, Allen's division held its ground, absorbing pressure and denying the enemy room to maneuver. Then, when the counteroffensive began, they went back on the attack, often at night. German reports captured after the war described the 104th as elite troops specializing in darkness. Defensive plans were rewritten. Units were forced to stay alert through the night, spreading themselves thin, exhausting men who could no longer rest. This was exactly what Terry Allen intended, an enemy that feared. The night could never recover, never regroup, never feel secure. By March 1945, the Timberwolves captured Cologne. They crossed the Rhine and drove deep into Germany, advancing faster than many veteran divisions. In just weeks, they covered hundreds of miles, shattering what remained of organized resistance. The Green Division the Germans had dismissed no longer existed. In its place stood soldiers who had been trained for this kind of war from the beginning, men who understood that survival depended not on bravery alone, but on preparation. The Germans learned the truth too late. The Americans had not just learned how to fight at night, they had mastered it, and under Terry Allen's command, the darkness belonged to them. In April 1945, as the war in Europe neared its end, the Timberwolves reached central Germany. There, they encountered Nordhausen. What Allen's soldiers found was not a battlefield, but the aftermath of industrial murder. Thousands of bodies lay where prisoners had been abandoned to die. Those still alive were skeletal, barely conscious, beyond saving for many. Hardened combat veterans, men who had survived months of night fighting, were shaken into silence. Allen ordered everything documented. He ordered nearby civilians brought in to see what had been done. War, he believed, had to be remembered honestly. Weeks later, as Germany collapsed, the Timberwolves linked up with Soviet forces. The war Allen had prepared for was over. He retired quietly in 1946, never promoted higher, never fully embraced by the institution he had served. Years later, his only son would be killed in Vietnam, leading soldiers in combat, just as his father had. Terry Allen never commanded armies. He never fit the Army's ideal image, but he proved something enduring. That training saves lives, that leadership is personal, and that wars are won not by appearances, but by preparation. The Germans who faced him learned that lesson in the dark, and the men who served under him never forgot it.